Imagine if your government told you that you were only allowed to have one child, not because you couldn't afford another, not because you didn't want another, but because your country had decided there were already too many people. For millions of Chinese families, this wasn't science fiction, it was reality. And here's the strange part. China once feared that it would have too many people. Today, it is increasingly worried about having too few. The policy designed to prevent a population explosion helped create a completely different problem decades later. Fewer young people, an aging population, shrinking families, and a workforce that is slowly getting smaller. So how did a policy meant to control China's future end up changing it so dramatically? To understand that, we have to go back to the beginning. After the Chinese Communist Revolution in 1949, China's population grew rapidly. Millions of people were being born, and the government became increasingly concerned that food, housing, jobs, and economic development could not keep up. The catastrophic Great Leap Forward and the famine that followed made the situation even more complicated. But as the population recovered, Chinese leaders became increasingly convinced that rapid population growth could prevent the country from becoming prosperous. By the 1970s, the government began encouraging families to marry later, have fewer children, and space births further apart. But Beijing eventually decided that voluntary restrictions were not enough. In 1979, China began implementing what became known around the world as the one-child policy. The idea seemed simple. If families had fewer children, population growth would slow, and in purely mathematical terms, it worked. Birth rates fell dramatically, but human beings are not equations. The policy became connected to a powerful system of birth permits, financial penalties, workplace pressure, and local enforcement. Families who violated the rules could face enormous fines and other consequences. In some periods and regions, enforcement also involved coercive practices, including forced abortions and sterilizations. But there was another problem. China already had a cultural preference for sons in parts of its population. Traditionally, sons were often expected to carry on the family name and support parents later in life, while daughters were sometimes viewed as joining another family after marriage. Under normal circumstances, this preference could influence family decisions. But now imagine combining that preference with a strict limit on the number of children a family could have. If you were allowed only one child and desperately wanted a son, what would happen if your only child was a girl? The consequences were profound. China's sex ratio became heavily skewed toward boys, particularly during the years when the policy was most strictly enforced. In some places, prenatal sex identification made it easier for families to know whether they were expecting a boy or girl. Girls were sometimes abandoned, hidden from authorities, or given up for adoption. Others were never properly registered, and every girl who was never born represented more than one missing person. She represented a future mother who would never have children of her own. This created a demographic chain reaction. Imagine a generation containing millions more boys than girls. Those boys would eventually become men, but there would not be enough women for all of them to marry. Some became known as bare branches, men who could struggle to find wives and establish families because of the gender imbalance. But the deeper problem was even more serious. The one-child policy wasn't simply reducing the number of children being born, it was changing the number of future parents. And demographic changes have a dangerous characteristic. They arrive late. A government can reduce births today, but it may take decades before the full consequences become visible. At first, the policy looked like a success. Fewer births, slower population growth, more resources concentrated on each child. And during the same period, China experienced an extraordinary economic transformation. Cities expanded, factories multiplied, millions of people were lifted from poverty. China's enormous workforce became one of the most important engines of global manufacturing. The country had discovered something economists call a demographic dividend, a large working-age population supporting relatively fewer children and elderly people. But underneath that economic success, the population structure was changing. The children of the one-child era were growing up, and many of them had no brothers or sisters. They became known as the little emperors, because parents and grandparents could concentrate enormous amounts of attention, money, and expectation on one child. For some, this created opportunities. Their families could invest heavily in education and provide resources that would have been impossible to divide among several children. But there was another side to being an only child: pressure. Imagine growing up knowing that your parents have sacrificed everything for you. Your grandparents have sacrificed for you, and everyone expects you to succeed. There is no sibling to share the expectations, no brother or sister to divide the responsibility of caring for your parents. You are the entire investment, and eventually, you may become the entire support system. This became one of China's most unusual family structures: 4 grandparents, 2 parents, and 1 child. The 4-to-1 family. 4 older people potentially depending on 2 adults, who may eventually depend on 1 child. At first, China's growing wealth made this structure manageable. But then the numbers began to change. China's working-age population started shrinking, while its elderly population continued to grow. And suddenly, the country faced a problem that could not be solved by simply building more factories or passing another law. There were fewer young people entering adulthood, fewer workers, fewer potential parents, and eventually fewer babies. This is where the story takes an unexpected turn. The government that had spent decades telling families to have fewer children suddenly needed families to have more. In 2016, China replaced the one-child policy with a two-child policy. The government expected millions of couples to respond by having another child, but the baby boom never arrived on the scale officials hoped for. So in 2021, China introduced a three-child policy. Think about how dramatic that reversal was. The same government that had once restricted families to one child was now encouraging them to have 3. But changing the law did not change society. Young couples had different priorities. Housing in major cities had become extremely expensive. Education was highly competitive. Childcare could be costly. Long working hours made raising children difficult, and for many women, motherhood could come with significant career costs. So when the government said, "Have more children," many young people were effectively asking, why? The problem was no longer simply government restrictions. The economics and culture of family life had changed. For an entire generation, smaller families had become normal. And once people adapt to a smaller family structure, removing the restriction does not automatically make them want larger families. You can change a law quickly. You cannot change an entire culture overnight. There is another important point here. China's demographic crisis is not entirely the fault of the one-child policy. Even without the policy, birth rates would probably have fallen as China became wealthier, more urbanized, and more educated. This happened in many other countries as well, but the one-child policy accelerated the transformation and made the eventual imbalance much more severe, and now the consequences are spreading into the economy. For decades, China's enormous workforce was one of its greatest advantages. Factories could recruit huge numbers of workers. Companies could produce goods cheaply and at massive scale. But what happens when the workforce begins shrinking? Labor becomes more expensive. Companies have greater incentives to automate. Some businesses look for workers in other countries. And an economy built partly around abundant labor has to find a new way to grow. China can use technology and automation to compensate for some of the decline. Robots can manufacture products. Artificial intelligence can increase productivity. Machines can replace certain forms of human labor. But technology cannot solve every demographic problem. A robot can build a car, but it cannot become a parent. It cannot buy a house for its family. It cannot create the next generation of consumers. And that creates another problem: demand. Fewer young couples can mean fewer first-time homebuyers. Fewer children can mean fewer students. Fewer families can mean less demand for certain goods and services. And an aging population tends to spend differently from a young population. This doesn't mean China's economy is simply going to collapse. That would be an oversimplification. China remains a massive economic and industrial power, but demographics change the environment in which an economy operates, and the pressure becomes even greater when you consider healthcare and pensions. An aging population requires more medical care. More people eventually need retirement support. More government resources have to be directed toward older citizens while fewer working-age people are available to generate tax revenue and provide services. Traditionally, Chinese families have played a major role in caring for elderly relatives. But what happens when families themselves become smaller? The state has to fill more of the gap. That means greater pressure on pensions, healthcare systems, nursing facilities, and younger workers. And this can create a vicious cycle. Young people face greater financial pressure. Having children becomes more expensive. People delay marriage or decide not to marry. They have fewer children or none at all. The next generation becomes even smaller. And then the burden becomes even greater for those who remain. This is why China's demographic problem is so difficult to reverse. The government can encourage births. It can offer subsidies. It can relax restrictions. It can promote marriage and family life. But it cannot simply manufacture millions of young people who want 3 children. And even if birth rates suddenly rose, those babies would not become workers for another 20 years. Demography moves slowly. Once a generation disappears, you cannot replace it overnight. And this may be the most important lesson of China's one-child policy. Population policies don't simply change numbers. They change families. They change expectations. They change the age structure of society. And eventually, they change the economy itself. China wanted to prevent the dangers of having too many people. It succeeded, but decades later, it discovered that having too few can create a different kind of danger. A smaller workforce, more retirees, fewer parents, fewer children, and greater pressure on every generation that remains. The one-child policy officially ended years ago, but its consequences did not end with it. They are still moving through Chinese society, one generation at a time. And perhaps the most unsettling part is that China now faces a problem that cannot be solved simply by changing a rule. Because you can tell people when they are allowed to have children. You can encourage them to have more. You can even offer financial incentives. But you cannot force an entire generation to want a bigger family. And that is the paradox at the heart of China's demographic crisis. The government once feared that China would have too many children, so it built a system designed to stop them. Decades later, China is trying to convince people to have more, but the generation that grew up under those restrictions has already changed the country. The policy controlled births, it changed families, it reshaped the population, and now, China has to live with the consequences of a decision that was made more than 4 decades ago. Because when you change the size of a generation, you don't just change the present, you change the future. And China's future is now discovering just how expensive that decision can be. If this story surprised you, let me know what you think in the comments. Do you believe China's one-child policy solved one problem while creating another? And if you found this story interesting and educating, like the video, subscribe to D Hidden Realities, and turn on notifications for more hidden stories that deserve to be uncovered.